Hi, everybody. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you to our program for May, which is going to cover election and voter issues. And we've got a lot we're planned to cover. I want to thank Kevin Johnson, Trevor Potter, and Hayden Johnson, another Johnson, for joining us for this program. And before I turn the program over to Kevin, who's serving as moderator this time, I want to please urge you to ask your questions by submitting them to the Q&A tab. And Kevin is going to monitor them and pitch them to our speakers for further discussion. So please keep your questions coming. We count on questions. And with that, I would like to introduce Kevin, who is the Executive Director of Election Reformers Network, a nonpartisan group focused on modernizing democratic institutions threatened by polarization. Kevin leads ERN's programs in impartial election administration, independent redistricting, and voting rules. Kevin also advises the Carter Center and previously served on the board of Common Cause Massachusetts and supported democracy building overseas with the National Democratic Institute. So Kevin, I'm turning the program over to you. I will disappear and come back later. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rhoda. It's a pleasure to be back again on the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm sure most of you here are quite familiar with the great programs that they run. If you're new, I really recommend that you check out the library of prior discussions. It's an amazing range of really interesting discussions on a whole range of topics. And we're hoping to add to that tonight with another good discussion. And that will, as Rhoda said, your questions will be key to that. So we've got a lot of interesting things we've teed up to talk about, but we want to answer the questions you have. So get them into the Q&A, and I'll be asking them I'll work them into other questions that I have. So to start, first I just want to say I'm just an honor to be here with 2 stars from Campaign Legal Center, which, as I think a lot of you know, is an organization that has done as much as anyone else in the country, really, in the fight to protect and advance democracy in the United States. I'll briefly introduce our 2 co-speakers. Trevor Potter is the president of the Campaign Legal Center, an organization dedicated to advancing democracy through law. A Republican former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, Trevor was general counsel to John McCain's 2000 and 2008 presidential campaigns, and an advisor to the drafters of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. The American Bar Association has described Trevor as hands down one of the top lawyers in the country on the delicate intersection of politics, law, and money. Trevor has appeared widely in national broadcast and print media. To many, Trevor is best known for his recurring appearance on the Colbert Report, which of course we all loved and remember well, as the lawyer for Stephen Colbert's super PAC, Americans for a Better Tomorrow, during the 2012 election. And Hayden Johnson is an attorney on litigation and policy projects across CLC's programs. Highlights from his CLC work include litigating disputes during the 2020 election, contributing to the development of the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is something we'll be touching on, confronting voter intimidation, and advocating against gerrymandering. Gentlemen, let's get to it. I would love to start off, Trevor, maybe with you, if you can just orient us to the work of CLC. What are the core areas that you're working in?
Sure, happy to, Kevin. It's a great pleasure to be here. And Rhoda, you were kind to have invited us to join you all. Campaign Legal Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., but we work all over the country and increasingly have widespread staff. We were founded 20 years ago, and we began working in the area of money in politics, preventing corruption, helping enforce the McCain-Feingold law, its disclosure provisions, pushing the FEC to do its job. So generally campaign finance. And since then, as democracy needs have grown, we have spread our coverage as well. And we focus on the freedom to vote, all of the issues relating to having citizens able to vote, we hope easily, and have their votes counted accurately and the results declared correctly. So anything to do with that voting process. Redistricting, which is to say, fighting against gerrymanders, whether partisan ones or racial ones. And we support independent redistricting commissions and work around the country on that. We have a government ethics focus and work both with the in Washington and in states around the country, helping states who are devising new ethics laws. So that range of work keeps us very busy. In the year coming, we have been doing a lot of work in some of the target states for 2024 in terms of working to ensure that those elections are free and fair, that they're not disrupted, and we have local partners we work with. We're both a litigation organization and a policy one, so we have lawyers who work on a range of citizen initiatives, helping draft them, advising legislators who are looking at legislation that may or may not be good for democracy. So that's our range of work. Hayden, anything you want to add to that from your perspective?
No, I think it's all been covered. CLC does a great job adjusting to the newest and latest of what are the threats to democracy, and that's under Trevor's lead.
There's no shortage of problems to fight, and I see you guys are working on many of them. So hats off to you. Let's dive in a little bit and get a kind of a concrete feel of your work on one specific challenge that's been really important recently and will continue to be an issue into 2024. And I'm talking about the reform of the way presidential electoral votes get counted, which sounds obscure, but is critically important. I know you guys played a lead role on that. I was on a call this morning with some of your colleagues on this very topic. Tell us about your work in the Electoral Count Reform Act, why it's important, and what's happening at the next level, at the state level.
Sure. Let me describe the broad aspects of it, and then Hayden, who has been deeply involved in all of this work, can give us the details of what we managed to do. But as we all recall, going back to January 6th of 2021, in addition to the attack on the Capitol, there was the series of problems and confusion over the counting of the electoral votes from the states. There had been lawsuits around the country. There had been claims by the Trump campaign that state legislatures did not have to accept the votes of their state, that legislatures could decide that somehow the election had failed and therefore they could appoint their own choice of electors. There were questions about alternative slates of electors, the role of the vice president. Could he decide to call out alternative slates rather than the ones signed by and presented by the governor? Then there were challenges on the floor. All of this is governed by the 1887 Electoral Count Act, which is usually described with the adjective impenetrable. It's full of Victorian language and not very clear on most of those key points. It says the vice president shall preside and open the ballots, but which ballots? It says one member of each chamber may object, but if they object, on what grounds, what do they do, etc. So we looked at all of that happening, which we had prepared for. We're part of the National Task Force on Election Crises, and we had done a lot of work in advance of the election, sort of gaming through what might go wrong. I must say, we thought before the election, much of that was pretty far-fetched. And unfortunately, almost everything we had thought could go wrong did or came close to in the post-election period. And part of it was the confusion in the Electoral Count Act. So when that day was over, we said we need to fix this before the next election. We cannot go into another election and another congressional vote counting session for the Electoral College with all these questions unresolved. And we reached out to colleagues across the country, assembled a team of constitutional law experts, had our own experts as well, and came up with a list of the problems in the Electoral Count Act and possible solutions. And then stage 2 of that was to work with the leadership in Congress, the committee structure in Congress, importantly of both parties. And we reached out to Democratic and Republican leadership in both chambers and worked with them for the next 18 months on a reform bill, an amendment to the original act. Hayden, why don't you talk a little bit about what it actually does, what the new law passed at the end of the last Congress accomplishes?
Sure, and before I do that, I have to give Trevor a shout out because there was many groups in our area that we were working with closely that didn't think that reforming the ECA was politically possible, and Trevor had good vision and lots of dedication of resources to try to find the path, and here we are with a totally reformed law that hopefully can avoid the problems that ailed us for January 6th. There's really 4 areas of ambiguities in the electoral count process that needed some updating with language or to clarify, perceived weaknesses in the law. That would be, states have a significant role in certifying their results. Congress counts the votes. Courts are involved at some level, but uncertain how under the prior law. And then the vice president, there was a significant contention over what exactly the vice president was supposed to be doing on January 6th. And this updated law, puts in place guidance where appropriate for the federal government, be telling the states how the process should go. It creates a streamlined litigation path through the federal courts to make sure that any disputes that raise a federal claim can make their way through the courts in an expedited process and eventually, could reach consideration in the U.S. Supreme Court. It clarifies that Congress has to meet a certain heightened vote threshold in order to have an objection to an electoral slate in order. And it makes it beyond doubt that the vice president just is there for the really ministerial role of opening the one slate of ballots from the state. So I think in those 4 areas, provided guidance where necessary, and then hard frameworks and cutoffs where the prior Electoral Count Act left some things up in the air.
Some of the issues that you talked about are suddenly becoming part of popular culture via the HBO program Succession, which this Sunday will, in the episode, there will be a scenario sort of like the scenarios Trevor mentioned, gaming out, of a arson-driven fire that changes the outcome of a presidential election that hinged just on a few thousand votes in one place. Does the newly amended Electoral Count Act offer a solution to that kind of crazy scenario of some accident or some manipulation destroying ballots in one location, and all of a sudden, what do we do from there?
So, my wife makes fun of me. It calls me a bad millennial because I don't keep up with the latest shows or what's happening in technology or anything. So I know a loose sense of what the show Succession dealt with, and I think it was set in Wisconsin, which is actually an interesting state because it's one of the few states that doesn't have a law that prescribes what happens in this scenario. It doesn't have a state law process for this. Fortunately, the Electoral Count Reform Act has what's called a force majeure clause, which is just basically what's called act of God or superior force has interfered with the proper processing of cast ballots. And so that would be sort of this scenario where a lot of ballots are caught up in a fire and it's uncertain what the results of the election. So you could sort of contemplate under the ECRA that there would be litigation challenging, what would be the right process here. So a state legislature would either, allow a recount of votes, and let's say the fire happened in Milwaukee, so Milwaukee would have, you would have a revote, a local isolated revote, and then any disputes arising out of that would follow this sort of litigation path that I mentioned earlier that's now set out in ECRA. And I think a lesson from 2020, and I think it's represented in the new ECRA, is that the courts held up remarkably well, that the federal courts at every turn shot down these frivolous election contests and various fraud allegations, because when you're in the courts, you have to prove things with evidence, and the courts have no tolerance for claims without evidence. And so I think by having a court process, we learned a lesson from 2020 that we can trust the judiciary to sort things out and to put themselves above politics to come to the right outcome.
I think Hayden's done a great job in explaining both the amendments and the fun twist in succession. The only thing I'd note in succession is that I believe one of the facts there is that the county knew whose ballots were in the warehouse that was destroyed, perhaps by arson. Therefore, they're not really holding a new election, which might have raised some issues. What they're doing is saying that a subset of the voters there had their ballots destroyed, and therefore their votes need to be recast. And so it's a little different. There's some questions about, well, can you hold a new election that's not on election date and so forth? And I think the producers gave us a route through that. Even if they did present the nightmare scenario where the ballots have been burned, as Hayden says, they could ask those voters to cast their votes again, but you have the weight of a major television network saying, no, we already know who won. And that doesn't present legal problems, but that presents problems for our democracy.
All right, well, we'll look forward to seeing that episode and where it goes from there. Questions about elections in two categories. First, regarding access to voting and the challenges to the full opportunity for everyone to vote. And second, regarding the impact of a vote and the elements of our system that dilute or unequally represent voting power. So first, voting options expanded substantially because of the pandemic. With lots of states started using or expanded early or mail-in voting. In many states, there's been a sort of a subsequent contraction, often based on unfounded claims of fraud in 2020. How do you two assess the net of all of that? Are we better off in terms of voter access than we were pre-pandemic? How much more work needs to be done?
Well, 2020 was just an enormous success for our system of elections. Remember, we were voting in the middle of COVID. People were afraid to be in indoor spaces and crowded spaces. There was a difficulty of candidates campaigning. And yet, because of the measures that were taken by states, and I will say some of the measures that CLC worked hard for in terms of ensuring that absentee balloting was available, that signatures, if they were questioned, voters would have a chance to verify their signatures and therefore have their ballots counted, all issues we worked on in court. But that election had a record turnout. The statistics I've seen are about 67% of all voting age Americans voted, which translates into about 94% of registered voters actually went to the polls. Those are huge numbers. Partly it was because it was a hotly contested election, but partly it was because states, counties, cities made it easier for registered voters to cast their ballot. And we saw all sorts of novel ways of voting. There were places that said, we'll be open 24 hours a day. You can come by. There were drive-by voting for people who didn't want to get out of their cars. They could roll their window down, show their ID, hand over their ballot to the poll worker in the box. So there were lots of ways that the ability to vote, early voting, obviously absentee voting, all of that made it easier for Americans to vote. And what we've seen since then is what I would characterize as a slightly allergic reaction to that success by some states. And it's pretty clearly targeted. I mean, you look at a state like Georgia, and their reaction was those big cities, i.e. those Democratic voters, had it too easy. So we're going to say you can't have 24-hour voting, or in Texas, you can't have drive-by voting, or you can't have absentee voting if you're under 65. But the sense, I think, in some of those states is it was made too easy to vote, particularly in urban areas, Democratic areas. And rather than making it equally easy in rural areas, the states tried to find ways to cut back. A couple targets have been absentee ballots, with states trying to cut back their availability or cut back the ability of groups to provide absentee ballot applications to voters. There are a bunch of nonprofits whose work is to send absentee ballot applications to voters and say, you know, fill this out, sign it, send it into your state, and you'll be able to vote at home. And states targeted that, made it very hard for those groups to do it. We ended up actually suing in both Georgia and Kansas because the groups that do that work with absentee ballots said, we're effectively prevented from doing it. We're going to go bankrupt, or we're going to break the law because they have said we can't do things that are perfectly legitimate, we've always done. And we just won a win on that last week in Kansas. But there was this push to make absentee voting harder. Some states have talked about getting rid of absentee voting entirely. Then drop boxes, for some reason, have become real targets. And that simply means a secure box, could be in a government building, might not be, but that is available, again, outside of normal business hours, so that people who work or have a couple of jobs will be able to come by and drop their ballot off. It's interesting because no one says, well, there's anything wrong with the ballot. It still has to have a signature or identifying mark that still has to be compared to the record before the vote is counted. But we have seen efforts like that across the country. Do you want to, Hayden, give a little more flavor to some of that?
Sure. I think there's been efforts to cut back on the ways that voters are able to actually turn in and cast their ballot. But even before you get to that point, there's been efforts to roll back prior expansions to access to voter registration, such as same-day voter registration, or the ability to stay on the voter registration rolls without too much headache for the voter. So it's sort of at all levels of the process here. And I think I sort of think about it in three buckets of new restrictions. One is sort of burdens on voters that sort of are imposed in an ad hoc way, that there's voters from a wide, many walks of life that are experience difficulties voting because of new laws at different degrees. The second category of restrictions on voter assistance. So like the laws that Trevor was talking about in Kansas and in Georgia, those states feel like they've done what they can, but that's politically possible to make it challenging to vote. So why don't we go ahead and work on the civic organizations that help voters overcome some of the existing barriers in the law. And then there's really a third category of restrictions that are more categorical, that say anyone with this type of prior felony conviction cannot vote, period. And those are sort of the three areas of restrictions, at least as I categorize them, that we are trying to go against, and several of them, work together in sort of pernicious ways against voters.
So what I'm taking from what you're saying is that if we net this out, we are worse off. That there's been a lot of contraction, and that relative to pre-pandemic, on the access basis, we're worse than we were pre-pandemic. Is that, just quickly, yes or where do you land on that?
It depends on what state you're in, which is
Aggregate, nationwide. I'm going to force you to take a broad opinion.
I think our count, Kevin, is there are about 10 states that have significantly tightened their voter laws. There are a number of others that have actually improved their laws, but we're in the middle of it. We're seeing it ongoing. Just last week, Idaho passed a law that says we are not going to allow government-issued photo IDs to be used to prove you are who you are, say you are when you go to vote, if it's a student ID. So you could use a concealed weapons ID, as you can in Texas, but not a student ID. And that is aimed at a population that the Republican legislature there unfortunately thinks isn't favorable to Republican candidates. So, and that was just last week. So we're seeing this around the country, but it's a push me, pull me.
Right.
Michigan looks as if they're about to pass some new laws that will significantly improve voter access. So it unfortunately does depend on where you live as to whether you're going to find it harder to vote or not.
All right, let's turn to the second half of this set of questions, and this is on the power of the vote. So in terms of sort of the impact that a voter's vote has on how they're represented and the policies in the world that they live in, what are the key problems that dilute that power or unequally represent voters?
Well, the whole area of redistricting, of course, is a problem for voters because under the normal system, the legislature draws the lines, and partisan legislatures of both parties draw lines that favor their incumbents in the legislature and their party in Congress. Now, in some states, citizens have been able, through the initiative process, to create independent commissions. But otherwise, you as a voter may live in an area where you are going to have no chance of really having representation because the legislature drew lines so that you are going to be a definite minority in that district. And that is, there are two types of that. One is racial gerrymandering, where communities of interest, communities of color are divided up and spread amongst various districts so that they don't have a chance of electing a member of their community in any one of them. And then the political gerrymandering, as we've seen in, say, a state like North Carolina, where there are 13 districts, the state is pretty much 50-50, and the legislature drew it with 10 Republican districts and 3 Democratic districts. There was a court case, we were involved in that case, and the head of the redistricting committee in the legislature was asked why they had drawn 10 Republican seats and only 3 Democratic seats in a state that was roughly evenly divided. And he said, because try as we could not figure out how to draw 11 Republican seats and 2 Democratic seats. So that means that if you've got a state that's 50% Democratic and they've only got 3 out of 13 congressional seats, they are underrepresented. And we see that on the flip side in states like Illinois, where a Democratic legislature has drawn very gerrymandered maps as well.
Anything more on that, Hayden? I'm going to follow up with a gerrymandering question, but I just wanted to, okay. So you mentioned North Carolina, and there was a Supreme Court decision just earlier this month, which Trevor, you and I talked about in the call in advance. Tell us why this is the court's decision on gerrymandering and on the inability of the court to address gerrymandering. Tell us about that decision, what it means, and how we deal with it.
Yeah, we're seeing here a game of ping pong. Unfortunately, I think the losers are American voters. This all started with the push that we have been very much part of to have gerrymandering declared unconstitutional under the U.S. Constitution. And we argued, our colleague Paul Smith argued in the Supreme Court on behalf of groups in Wisconsin, a very gerrymandered state, that was unconstitutional. We knew we had a majority of the Supreme Court who have said in the past that gerrymandering is wrong and violates the Constitution, but they said we don't know what standard to apply to review a map and determine if it's a impermissible political gerrymander. So in the Wisconsin case, we had several standards that we thought accurately showed just how gerrymandered it was. 50-50 state, roughly 60-40 for one party. Even if a majority voted for the Democrats, they didn't lose, the Republicans didn't lose any seats. They still had 60 of the 99 in the legislature. So we went to the court. Unfortunately, Justice Kennedy, who we thought was going to be the fifth vote to say that Wisconsin was unconstitutional, was about to retire, something we didn't know. And he decided not to be the key vote in that case and instead send it back to Wisconsin for further judgment. So that led to North Carolina. They had a similar gerrymandered district, as I've just described, and series of districts. And that case went to the Supreme Court, but Justice Kennedy was gone by then. And there, the court ruled 5-4 that these cases really didn't belong in federal court, that they closed the courthouse door on political gerrymandering. They'll still have to deal with racial gerrymandering cases, but the political ones, they said, you know, we're not suited to this as judges. These are hard cases. We're going to leave it to the states. Now, the problem with that is a number of federal courts had already ruled and found standards that were useful and which states had gerrymandered. So the court really here is just ducking the question. What they say is turn it over to the states, but that often doesn't work. First of all, yes, you have state legislatures, but they're almost always the ones responsible for the gerrymander. Then you have state Supreme Courts and state constitutions. In North Carolina, the state Supreme Court interpreting the state constitution had concluded that the North Carolina gerrymander violated North Carolina law. And they had to redraw districts. But North Carolina also elects its Supreme Court, and they've had an election since then, a turnover of justices, and the new court has said, no, we don't think actually that the gerrymander violates North Carolina law. And furthermore, that we don't think that our courts in North Carolina are up to deciding these questions, which leaves it again back in the laps of the legislature. But what happened in the middle of that whole ping pong match is once the North Carolina maps were declared by the North Carolina Supreme Court to be unconstitutional under the state constitution, the legislature sued and said, wait a minute, we're the ones that are supposed to be drawing these maps. We can't have a state court telling us what to do. And they said the US Constitution says the legislature decides the time, place, and manner of elections, and thus the seats. That's the case that's currently before the Supreme Court. And it is possible that the court could rule in that case that only legislatures can draw these lines, in which case nobody can challenge gerrymandering. Now, because of the change I've mentioned in North Carolina and the fact that that court has reversed its earlier decision with new justices on it, it is possible the Supreme Court won't continue with that case. They may say that it's now what lawyers call moot, meaning there's no case or controversy left in North Carolina. But that issue, the whole idea that state legislatures are somehow immune from their state constitutions and their state Supreme Courts and can do anything they want no matter how bad, is, I think, going to come back again to the court if it's not dealt with in this case.
So the House passed a law back in a couple of years ago that called for every state to set up an independent redistricting commission. That was, of course, when the House was controlled by Democrats. All Democrats voted for it, all Republicans voted against it, and it passed the House, and then it died in the Senate. Later versions of that same law stepped back from that much of a mandate and instead, here are standards for how redistricting should be done so that it's fair. Now, given these state level decisions, is it time for Congress should we be looking for Congress at this point as the solution, as the right place for national standards to be established that can reduce some of the excesses of state legislative run gerrymandering?
Hayden, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I mean, I think Kevin, it would be great for Congress to step in, but Congress is an institution where members benefit from gerrymandering, and so it's hard to see the incentives always align where members elected from gerrymandered districts would then take it upon their good graces to eliminate gerrymandering. Though we can hope for that to be the case, and a federal standard would be a great solution to the problem. I think, as it stands right now, the fight is in state courts, and that's, as Trevor mentioned, that's what Rucho in the U.S. Supreme Court said was the right place to go from here, that there's going to be idiosyncrasies to take into account in various states, and state courts would be a good place to go to apply state constitutional protections, just like you do in any other situation, against redistricting laws that violate their citizens' rights. So I think a federal standard would be ideal, and it's certainly within Congress's power to do that. But I hesitate to put all of our hope in Congress when gerrymandering works to some of those members' benefits, and instead state courts are certainly empowered to protect their citizens' constitutional rights.
You said some of those members, senators, of course, aren't affected by gerrymandering. And is there a scenario that some Republican senators are getting a little anxious, shall we say, by what they see? I mean, one of the studies on gerrymandered districts tend to claim that they're partly responsible for greater extremism in who's in Congress. Is there a dynamic there that can lead to a place where there's sort of an interest in seeing more moderation, or is this too much to hope for? Starting from the Senate, but since senators don't benefit from gerrymandering, and since they maybe do feel some pain from the impact of gerrymandering, is there a possibility that there might be a set of interests that could align there?
I think, going back to the original point you made, it was actually the House, the Democratic majority, that passed legislation that, had it gone through the Senate, would have required these independent commissions. Now you have a Republican majority. This has unfortunately become a partisan issue, at least in Congress, and they show no signs of wanting to move a bill like that. In terms of the Senate, the problem is you need 60 votes. And when the House bill came over, it was, even when it was rewritten by Senator Manchin to change the redistricting to essentially overturn the Supreme Court Wisconsin decision and require federal courts to deal with redistricting cases and give them a standard, they did not have 60 votes to cut off debate and proceed to a vote. So basically, it was sunk in the Senate because of the Senate procedures. And that's what I don't see changing at the moment. Getting 60 votes for this in the Senate, when it's not clear they're right, but when Republicans think that they benefit from it. And let me go into that a little bit, because a number of states have a process whereby citizens can put initiatives on the ballot, and many of those initiatives have dealt with creating independent commissions. But they often have been in more democratic states like California, whereas the very Republican states like Texas and Florida do not have independent commissions, and the legislature has had a very free hand in gerrymandering. Although, footnote on Florida, their state constitution had an initiative that said you cannot have partisan line drawing. And so the Florida gerrymander is being challenged in state court, and those suits are underway. But generally, I think Republicans think they've got the better end of the deal at this moment. They're more Republican gerrymandered seats than Democratic ones. So I think the partisan nature of the debate makes it hard to see Congress agreeing on any of this, which is why state action becomes at the moment the way to go. Hayden, would you talk a little bit about, the Michigan situation where we were successful and the Utah situation, which you're now fighting in court?
Yes. So in Michigan, Campaign Legal Center helped support a ballot initiative that created an independent process that was avowedly nonpartisan. And, it was a success in the 2021 redistricting process. However, in Utah, the CLC also supported a ballot initiative there, but the legislature subsequently repealed the ballot initiative that had created independent commission to take the lead on drawing district lines, as well as a prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. And so, unsurprisingly, without a strong independent commission and without the anti-gerrymandering standards in place, the legislature gerrymandered the state, to the most extreme level that it could, to produce, an entire congressional delegation favoring the majority party in Utah. And so we're litigating that case right now in the Utah Supreme Court, asking the court there, much like other courts have done in states like Alaska and Pennsylvania and Ohio, to step in and to protect their citizens' constitutional rights. In Utah, it's both to uphold the ballot initiative that created the independent process and the partisan gerrymandering prohibition, but also to go after the actual lines that infringed Utah's constitutional rights.
That's encouraging to hear about that state work. There are a couple of really interesting questions in the Q&A, which I'm going to turn to now, and then as more questions come back, I will turn back to a couple that I've set up. Michael James wants to know, can you speak to cybersecurity in voting? There always seemed to be a segment of the population that fears or blames voting machines as compromised or hacked. How relevant or worrisome is this issue?
We came out of 2020 with a really extraordinary set of imaginative allegations about electronic voter fraud. A whole series of claims, which honestly were hard to believe were being made, that there were satellites floating over Italy that were somehow controlling voting machines in this country, or the machines we're using had been programmed out of Venezuela, etc. Now, a couple points on that. One, all of those allegations, as Hayden noted early on, were subject to lawsuits and battles in courts where people had to present evidence. And there is no evidence of any of those particular occurrences. We're all familiar with the Fox News litigation and the claims against that Dominion had somehow rigged the machines, and the enormous verdict that Dominion got as a result of those claims. The reason that those claims in general don't make sense is that the way the machines work, they are not connected to the internet, which I think most people don't understand. They are freestanding machines they count votes and show the votes on the machines. The voting officials go from machine to machine looking at the tallies, and they then prepare those and send them in to the state headquarters or the county headquarters. But the whole design of the system is to ensure that they're not interconnected, so that somebody can't hack in to the system and change the vote totals. So the theories that the machines are somehow rigged depends on a technician going in and physically dealing with the machine and changing somehow the software machine by machine. And so what I think people don't understand when they complain about the machines is that not only are they not connected to the internet, but they themselves are the anti-fraud mechanism we have. In the old days, the phrase ballot stuffing came from the fact that you had paper ballots and boxes, and it was possible for an election official to take a bunch of paper ballots, mark them up, and stick them in the box when no one was looking, or at least the opposition wasn't looking, and then count them, and there is no record of how they got there. With a machine, it's voter by voter, and you can't stuff it, and the election officials can't manipulate the machine. So it was, the purpose of it was to prevent voter fraud and make sure that every voter only voted once, no poll workers cast extra ballots, and then that the votes got correctly counted. Hayden, do you want to add to that? I'm sure there are pieces I'm missing there.
Well, I think it's just, we've had 2 years of intense, really like relentless scrutiny on voting machines. And if there was some widespread problem or any serious problem with the voting machines, we would have found it by now. And even in states like Arizona that have partisan-led what they called audits of the electoral process to look for perceived problems with voting machines. Even the report produced from that sort of cooked up process said there was nothing untoward with Arizona's elections, that the results were accurate. And so I think it's just, it becomes such a big distraction to take us away from the real problem here, which is that states are passing laws that make voting more challenging for their citizens for no good reason.
And do you see this kind of either swinging, if we want to use a pendulum metaphor, kind of swinging back, or petering out? I mean, or is there a dynamic that's sort of self-generating that has to do with the media, the ways in which certain media companies have found new kinds of profitability by channeling and tapping into certain communities and concerns? Will we be hearing more of kind of crazy theories about voting machines 2 years from now, 3 years, or can we expect this to kind of come back to sanity at some point? Crystal ball, what do you see?
I think we recognize that when you've had now 2.5 years of some media focusing on allegations of fraud and reporting that again and again, and repeating, as with Fox, these really quite far-fetched allegations about voting machine fraud, that will stick. If people hear enough of that, they will ask, as your questioner did, what is all this about? I keep hearing this stuff. It creates an underlying mistrust of the system, which then makes people receptive to the next set of charges. So in 2022, you had the Arizona elections, and the Republican candidate for governor there, Carrie Lake, was in court still today, arguing that there was something wrong with some of the voting machines in that state. And what I think it means is that there's going to be a segment of the population that has now grown used to hearing about potential voting machine fraud and is going to be receptive to any candidate who comes along and says, I would have won except for those voting machines. And I think that that's a problem because we want, of course, citizens to have faith in the election process and believe the votes are being counted and announced accurately. But when it's in the interests of some people to cast aspersions on that and to lead voters to think that the results aren't accurate, it's very hard to go back and rebuild that trust. So I think we have directly to answer your question, I think we have a long-term problem here that is not going to be easily solved. You know, if you wanted to try to solve it by saying, well, no one trusts machines, so even though they're fine, we'll get rid of them and vote only on paper, which is one of the calls we're hearing out there, we would have an unbelievably difficult, complicated election with disputes over who won. In Nevada, one of the smaller counties decided not to keep their machine count and instead to go in and count the paper ballots, because that's a county where you actually put a paper ballot into the machine and it counted them. So they said, we're going to count it by hand instead. And they did so over several days. And the problem is they came up with 3 different results in 3 different hand counts, because it's not easy to count thousands of ballots. And remember that we're not talking about a ballot that says one line on it, I vote for Trump or Biden for president. You're talking about a ballot where you're electing senators, House members, mayors, governors, state legislators, dog catchers, sheriffs. You're voting on bonds. You're voting on voter initiatives. It can be a long, complicated ballot. So imagine trying to do that on paper and count every one of those races correctly. But it's not realistic. Plus, as I've indicated, it really could give you the possibility of fraud. So I think that being the case, we're caught here between a group of citizens who've been told machines are bad on the one hand, and the reality is that a paper alternative would be significantly worse.
We'll have a live experiment in Shasta County, California, where the county commission has forced that county not to use machines, and it's going to be really difficult on the election workers there. On to other questions. Robert Shermer asks, has your work strengthened the evidentiary requirements to challenge a national election? Have individual states accepted these requirements?
Hayden, do you want to have thoughts?
I think the ECRA did strengthen what has to be shown to, call into question the results of the election. And I think, individual states have realized that they need to, strengthen some of their internal state processes as well, to realize that, there's a weakness here, that there's too much discretion in this certain election board. We need to shore that up. And I think, where there's been a great benefit from the reformed Electoral Count Act is that in Congress, it doesn't take just one pair of votes to begin debate on an objection to an electoral count slate. It now takes, the heightened threshold that you have to really have some, basis in evidence to even begin that process. Otherwise, like we saw on January 6th, individual members could really logjam the process and sow doubt in the public on the results based on various spurious claims of election fraud. So I think that the ECRA has really helped, make sure that anything that can actually delay the finalization of presidential election results has to be something serious.
I wonder if there's sort of an element of popular judicial literacy, let's say, that's needed here. I mean, you can think of how many citizens understand the concept of innocent till proven guilty and how that might apply in a murder case, because they've seen courtroom TV so many times, and they actually get pretty close to thinking about what does it really mean, innocent until proven guilty? What does it really mean, beyond a reasonable doubt? But we don't, an election sort of has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And it seems to me there are suspicions around this that don't have that same framework at all. We almost need to kind of do that same education about judicial literacy around elections. Any thoughts about that before I go on to other questions here?
Well, I think part of it is that if a candidate wants to challenge the result of the election, they have to show that somehow something went wrong, and it went wrong or the votes were miscounted at a scale that would affect the result of the election. So to come in and say, well, there were improprieties at the polling place, the first question is, were there? And that's a factual question. But the next one is, were those significant enough to affect the result of the election? If you lost by 30,000 votes and you're able to show that 3 votes may have been impermissible, you won't overturn the election. And that's why, as Hayden's been explaining, you have these trials and you have a very different standard inside the courtroom than you do when you're outside talking to the press, making broad allegations. Inside, you have to actually present proof, and you have to show that your proof would have made a difference in the result of the election. I would note that one of the things I think that's troublesome from the 2020 election is that there were lawyers around the country who went into court and made statements that actually were false. Various judicial systems and bar associations have either penalized lawyers for doing that or suspended their license to practice law, because that really is a threat to the system. If you take the same rhetoric that you're using outside to gin up your supporters and talk to the press, and then you come in and you lie about it in court, that makes it hard for the judicial system to operate. And so there really has been pushback from bar associations and others who regulate conduct in courtrooms to make sure that doesn't happen again.
All right, we're getting a number of questions here, so I'm going to ask you to try to answer quickly if you can. Here, this next question kind of gets to, sort of forcing a prioritization of what's the most, if you had to choose among the different threats: limited access to the polls, gerrymandering, partisan secretaries of states, others. What do you point to as the key, the biggest threat we should worry about?
Thoughts on that, Hayden? I'm tossing you the hot potato.
Yeah, they're all really interrelated, so it's hard to pin it down. And maybe this is just a little bit of recency bias since I'm working on our Utah partisan gerrymandering case, but I see that as very foundational. It's sort of, if folks that are gerrymandering are successful, it doesn't matter how many people are able to really cast the ballot, because they're able to draw the lines so strategically with great precision and access to, sophisticated technology and this world of data to ensure that, okay, all these folks can go out there and cast their vote. It's not going to matter for state legislature. It's just not going to matter for Congress, because we've drawn the lines to be, so lopsided and durable over a 10-year period that, it's politicians picking who gets to vote for them. And so I see that as sort of at the base here, and we need to figure that out and sort of make a fair playing field. And then we can work on a lot of these other issues. But of course, it's hard to say that one is more important than the other, because they really, work together to make voting just not quite what we expect in American democracy.
Now, you wonder if, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, let me just throw out an analogy there, which is, it's like looking at the workings of a complicated clock and saying which one of those wheels is the most important. If you take any one of them out, the clock doesn't work. If you have a highly partisan Secretary of State who sets out to sabotage the system, that's a problem. If you have a governor of Georgia who acceded to a presidential request to declare the result fraudulent or just find 11,000 more votes, that would be a big problem. So each of those pieces has to work together, both to produce accurate results and to have voters understand that their votes are being counted and they can trust the result. And so any one of these throws that out of kilter.
A great answer, thank you. Question from Arthur Lerman, talking about the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, and this is a bipartisan caucus. Any possibility that caucus can have an impact on passing national standards to make the impact of votes in different districts and states more equal?
I think the problem solvers have done a really good job of trying to start across the aisle conversations. They tend to have had success on the less publicized issues where you don't have a bitter partisan divide. It's going to be harder for them on the big ticket ones, like say the debt ceiling and things like that, where the party lines are really firm. Instead, it's where they can compromise behind the scenes and people are not dug into their partisan trenches. I think there are issues where there are compromises available in Congress, and the problem solvers is a good venue for some of those to be talked through and vetted. The question will become, will the leadership allow those to come to the floor for a vote in the House? And in the Senate, is it bipartisan enough to get 60 votes? So I think groups like the problem solvers are important in terms of getting the conversations going. But the way Congress works nowadays, at the end of the day, particularly in the House, it is the leadership that has the ability to decide we're not going to bring something to the floor, and almost impossible to overrule that if that's what the leadership decides.
All right, a question on political spending from Marie Henzether Kimmel. And Marie, thank you. I know you sent this by email, and so definitely wanted to get to this. This is about the impact of political spending, especially by dark money, social welfare, nonprofit entities. What impact has that had on the spread of election disinformation and election denialism?
Hayden, you want to try that?
Sure, I will defer to you, Trevor, as the renowned expert in dark money. But I think there has been quite the connection between groups that are spreading falsehoods about the election and groups that are doing so through the use of dark money to not know the originating source. And I think it goes to show that there's a free speech problem there, that there's an ability to drown out the truth with lots of anonymous spending, and it prevents voters and good government groups from being able to speak in the same way, because they won't go down into the dark money trenches with the group on the disinformation side. There was some federal efforts to try to go after disinformation and the source of dark money behind it. And I think it's very challenging to regulate in that area, but it's just important to remember that that's not really what our framers had in mind when they set up the marketplace of ideas. And you have political sides debating, and the best idea wins. It's not an equal speech and open public forum when one side can use dark money to spread falsehoods in the electoral process.
I'd add, Kevin, two thoughts there. One is in terms of dark money spent in elections to influence elections and elect candidates. There is good news. States are working at trying to require disclosure of spending in elections. In Arizona, just this past election, the voters approved by 72% a initiative that will require the disclosure of all money spent in elections, of dark money. And remember, Arizona is the state that voted in most of its statewide elections, 50.1% to 49.9% between the candidates for the major parties. And yet 72% said, yes, we want a new law that requires the disclosure of dark money spending in elections. So that, of course, is being challenged in court. CLC is representing the initiative in both in state and federal court. There are two challenges there, but we're hopeful that that will be a model for other states to require this disclosure. But the other half of the question is, if we're talking election disinformation, it's often not in the context of the election itself. It is after the election by internet sites, news media sites, areas that are probably not going to be covered even by any sort of dark money disclosure, either because it's the First Amendment or because it won't be seen as influencing the direct outcome of the election, but rather broader issues. And that's the problem with that, is it's so siloed. People who don't believe that stuff probably won't even know it's being said. They won't hear it. They're not looking at that website or listening to that radio jock that's saying all those things, so that it gets targeted at the true believers, and the rest of us aren't even often aware of the disinformation that's out there.
The silos get more and more separated, and on we go. A question from Arnold Rubin. I think tongue-in-cheek, were there a lot of ballots with votes just for Biden and not for down ballot candidates, to explain why only Biden benefited from stuffing, because Democrats didn't win much of the down ballot races? Anything? I mean, there are all sorts of logical inconsistencies in most of the conspiracy and fraud theories. But anything more you'd say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I was thinking that very thought as we were talking about machine fraud and satellites in Venezuela, which is, if you wanted to steal an election and you were going to all that trouble to make it possible for Biden to have fake votes, wouldn't you also bring along the Democratic Senate candidates and House candidates and so forth? Republicans did well in 2020, except for the presidential ticket. So I think that he makes a very fair point, that is further evidence that the machines weren't rigged, because you wouldn't have done it just in one race.
Okay, and a question that touches on an ethics issue, and I know that's been is another important part of your work. And here, there's been a lot of talk about ethics in the Supreme Court. Do you think there's a connection between the rampant corruption at the Supreme Court, parens, Harlan Crow Thomas, the Gorsuch property sale, Roberts' wife's payments, et cetera, and parens, and the Roberts Court's consistent decisions that seem to be weakening our democracy? What are your thoughts on that?
Hayden, I know you've thought about those issues. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's I don't know if we can say that there's a tie between those ethics lapses and outcomes at the court, but I think what we can say is we're in a unique position at CLC and among other groups that are playing a lot of defense to keep our cases out of the Supreme Court. And it's because, these positive decisions from the past that expand voting rights, that expand access, are being rolled back. And efforts at the federal level to legislate in this area are, with the Voting Rights Act and various campaign finance laws, are being ruled to violate the Constitution. And I think what we're doing is working really hard to convince the court that this is doing serious damage to our democratic institutions. And in fact, the Constitution goes the other way, that it protects the proper functioning of the electoral process, and that courts are supposed to play an important role to continue the electoral process and make sure that politicians aren't changing the rules to benefit themselves, and instead to make sure that the voting process is fair and represents the proper results.
I think there's also something to be said for the fact that this information about the question being raised about the travel and the vacations and everything else, reflect what has become sort of two different ecosystems on the court. The new justices largely come out of the Federalist Society. If you look at Justice Thomas and all the accounts of vacations, they're vacationing with Federalist Society leaders, with people who would share their very conservative views. I think what we're seeing is that the conservative justices now swim largely in a conservative ecosystem, and it reinforces their judicial instincts. Justice Thomas goes home to a spouse who was one of the leaders of the attempt to help President Trump overturn the election. So what they're hearing is going to, I think, reinforce their views in a way that may not have been true when the courts were less partisan and less polarized.
Another area where we are seeing kind of the conspiracy theories and the skepticism that comes out of all of this misinformation begin to penetrate and filter into our system is in election administration. In 2022, there were over a couple of dozen folks who ran for secretaries of state positions in different states who, were pretty clearly opposed to the results of 2020. Very few won at that level, but many have won at local levels. How do you think about this from the bigger perspective of, how we put people into election positions? Do these developments start to call into question our long tradition of having election officials with close ties to competing political parties?
We're one of the few advanced democracies that has the election administration system elected by party. That most countries start out with the idea that the administrators, the officials, should be nonpartisan because they're adjudicating disputes between the parties. But that's not been the American system, and it's hard to change that in midstream. I think people are used to voting for officials at all levels, but that in itself makes the polarization we're seeing really problematic. Even though they were partisan, in general, election officials were very professional. And what we're seeing now are people with very specific agendas seeking office. That was true of the Secretary of State elections that your question refers to. It is particularly true in local election offices, in county boards, where people who feel passionately that the election was stolen want to take over the system and change it. And we've had candidates say, if you elect me, we'll never have another Democrat elected in this state. That was out, I believe, of Wisconsin. So that, I think, increases a lack of faith in our system. The other side of this is that these disputes, heated as they are, has made it very difficult to recruit election observers, election officials. People have had their lives threatened. They have worried about violence. I was recently in Arizona, where the two top officials in Maricopa County, which is Phoenix, which is 62% of the voting population of the state, so enormous. They're essentially in witness protection programs. They had so many threats against their lives, they had to leave their houses. Their families had to go into hiding. They have protection. There was a long piece recently in the Washington Post about Bill Gates, who's the head of the Maricopa County Board. These have become really difficult jobs and high profile jobs, which they never were. And it may be that part of the agenda of people who want to change the results is to chase these people out of office and either be able to replace them with election deniers or replace them with incompetents or people who won't know how to run an election, in which case we will have problems running elections.
A follow-up question about how we select who is going to, be in positions of seniority in our election administration, but this time about our common structure of pairing Democrats and Republicans. And I want to point to your experience at the FEC, which of course is one of the many bodies with that sort of Noah's Ark structure of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, designed to fail so that nothing gets done, successful sometimes. Maybe a model that worked better back then, and now as polarization has increased, it's even more of a questionable approach. What do you think of that pairing in these kinds of bodies, and whether that's something we should continue to use, or is it served its purpose?
Well, starting with the FEC, I think it was not designed to fail. It came out of a Congress which, Republicans and Democrats talked to each other, worked with each other, compromised. That bill was a bipartisan bill. What they wanted was to make sure that no one party could take control of the commission and use it as a weapon of government against the other. So they have essentially 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. It takes 4 votes to take any action. I think the expectation was that it would work as Congress did, which is they would talk through the issues, they would compromise, and they would enforce the law on a fair bipartisan basis against both parties equally. I know when I was there, there was a case before us, and it was pretty clear to me as a Republican commissioner that this was a blatant violation of the election laws, as it happened by a Democratic candidate and a prominent Democratic candidate. And one of my colleagues during the break in the discussion came over to me and said, you're right on this one, and I'm going to vote with you, but you better vote with me when it's one of yours who have broken this law. And I did. I mean, there was a feeling that our job was to work to enforce the law and to do so fairly and on an even-handed basis. That worked in that environment. It doesn't work today at the FEC because we've ended up with 3 commissioners, Republican commissioners, who basically don't appear to believe in the role of the commission. I think they reflect a Republican view that we'd be better off without an FEC and without these laws. But since Congress is never going to repeal them, we'll just stop them in their tracks, because without 4 votes, without one of those 3, you can't enforce any of this. You can't open an investigation. You can't pass a rule requiring disclosure, etc. And I think that reflects the polarization we see in Washington. If you had Republican commissioners today who were voting with Democrats to investigate both parties, I suspect there would be a lot of Republicans in Congress who would be furious about that. And so that makes the one of each party model that you're describing harder to function if people are expected somehow to be only voting the way their party wants them to.
Interesting history. Thank you for that. Sam Gary asks, in the larger context of the 20th and 21st centuries, how high is voter skepticism regarding the illegitimacy of elections? How about disenfranchisement of voters? I think we should think of this question as now relative to the history of it. Where are we now relative to those times? That's how I interpret the question. Maybe that's
Hayden, thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I think a lesson looking at the sort of long arc of voting work is, the voting process is one of expansions and contractions, and there's times where there's, great boon to voters after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, for example. I think we find ourselves in a contraction now. I think what's new compared to prior times, as far as the skepticism point of the question, is that there's candidates that lose by a landslide, and they cast the results into doubt, that they say, well, there's no way I could have lost by this big of a margin, so it must have been a fraudulent election. And that seems, that being as widespread as it is, and encouraging their supporters to question the results of the election and not conceding to the winning candidate, that seems to be something new here that I think all of us in the pro-democracy work are trying to grapple with and figure out ways to encourage voters to retain their faith in elections despite losing candidates, doing everything they can to, you know, take that down.
That concession speech, how important it is, and how we for a while have taken it for granted.
Well, we did. You know, you go back to Richard Nixon, he didn't challenge John Kennedy's win in 1960 because he, even though there were questions about voting in Illinois, because he said that'd be a terrible thing for the country. And we can't put the country's international reputation at risk. Al Gore in 2000 accepted the Supreme Court decision. He didn't go out there and say that Bush is an illegitimate president. I think the American tradition of saying, look, but there's a great line, you'll forgive me, I think I can say this on this call. The voters have spoken, the bastards. You know, you accept the results, you go back and fight again the next day or the next year, but you don't say it's all illegitimate and they're not president or they're not the winner.
I spent a time working overseas on democratization. A fair amount of that was in Africa, and there was a period of time where no president there was no person serving in office who had said, I accept the will of the vote and I step out of office. And we supported so many folks, you know, in organizations where literally people were dying to hear that. And I remember coming back to the States on 1992 when and landing when George Bush's concession speech was made. I just, you know, what a beautiful thing this is. And I didn't think that I would come to the time when I would cherish it even more because of its, you know, new rareness. Final questions to close up. Tell us, 2024 is on everyone's mind. What are some of the areas of concern for Campaign Legal Center about 2024? What are you doing about it? And then what should people be doing today leading up to 2024 if they are concerned about carrying out free and fair elections?
Well, we have focused on a couple key states where there have been attacks on the election system, where there are ongoing attempts to change it either for better or worse. And so we're working this year and next in those states, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Each of them has different issues. In Pennsylvania, for instance, that's one of the holdout states that doesn't allow election officials to do what's called pre-processing of ballots that are mail-in ballots or absentee ballots. And that other states, Arizona does do pre-processing. What they do is they check the signatures on the ballots when they come in. And if there are any questions about the signature or the voter, they can address them at that time. They then get the ballots ready to be counted, to be fed into machines and counted. So on election night, when they're getting their vote totals from the people who voted that day, they're also getting the vote totals from the mail-in absentee ballots, and they can release them at one time. So Arizona, we knew, even controversially, we knew who had carried that state by 11 o'clock at night on election night. Pennsylvania doesn't allow that sort of pre-processing. So literally, the mail-in ballots start coming in weeks ahead of the election. They're left in boxes. They're untouched through election day. And only that night, after they've gotten through the same day totals, do they then start to look at the ballots, open them, check the signatures, begin to count them. So the effect of that is The Pennsylvania count takes several days, and it creates suspicions. Because if you have, as you did in 2020, one candidate, the Republican candidate, saying don't vote absentee, vote on election day, and the Democrats saying vote in advance, you're going to have very different pools of results depending on which one you're counting. And so, as we may recall on election night, Trump was ahead at election night. The next morning, he was, as these ballots started to be counting, that lead was going. A day later, it was gone. Well, that's, going to cause people who are suspicious to say, wait a minute, what happened? He was ahead and suddenly all these ballots came in the middle of the night. Where do they come from? So if you could have them all coming in at the same time and processed at the same time, you would avoid that problem. So Pennsylvania, that's one of the issues we're looking at. Arizona, as we've already talked about, has the threats of violence against officials. I see I'm running out of time. Hayden, do you want to throw anything in as our last word?
I think you pretty well covered it, Trevor. I think we're just trying to cover the waterfront here on protecting voters and the electoral process, whatever threats might come up.
It is a state-by-state election, as we know, and so there's state-by-state issues. For what can we do? I think the answer is pay attention to what's happening in your state. If you see something you don't like, say that, write representatives. And if you see something that could be improved, let's get that done before next year.
Rhoda, over to you, but beforehand, let me just say thank you, gentlemen. That was just wonderful. And maybe I'll just also chime in on the what you can do. If you know folks who really love elections, and particularly folks on the younger scale who may be looking for new areas to go into, we need a lot of recruitment of good people going into election administration. It's an incredibly important role. There's huge drain now of people retiring. But boy, what a satisfying kind of work to do for our democracy. Rhoda, thank you.
That's
Absolutely.
really important, Kevin. Thank you for that. Rhoda, if I could, my one pitch would be stay informed. Feel free to go to the Campaign Legal Center website, which is really easy to remember. It's campaignlegalcenter.org. And you'll be up to date on many of these issues.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you, Kevin, for handling this so well and doing a great moderator job. And thank you, Trevor and Hayden. My God, we got so much information. It was really wonderful. And you're all working so hard to undo the damage and to take on the challenges. We all have to help you do your work. So thank you so much. And to our audience still with us, we will be sending you a survey tomorrow. And we hope that you will respond to it. We really welcome your feedback. We want to know what you've learned and if you learned a lot. And we also hope that those of you who are new to NFRPP and this may be your first program, please go to our website and sign up for our notices of our future programs. We cover lots of different issues, as Kevin said early on. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Hayden, for such an outstanding job tonight. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to really having a second round of this later on. So I hope you'll be available in the future as we want to be updated on all of this. Say yes.
Thank you for the invitation to join you.
We'd be honored.
Thank you.
Thanks for all you do, Rhoda.
Okay, thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.